The heaviest burdens are often the ones we place in our own hands. Yet the moment we feel their full weight, something in us recoils not from their mass, but from the fact that we chose to lift them. This recoil has 1,000 faces. It appears as the conviction that circumstances have trapped us, that our nature determines us, and that the role we occupy defines what we can become. It whispers that we are effects rather than causes, passengers rather than pilots. And in that whisper, there is something like relief. This is not mere weakness. It is a structure of consciousness so fundamental that it precedes most of what we call character. Before we decide who we will become, we have already learned how to evade the fact that we must decide at all. The evasion is older than our reasons for it, more instinctive than deliberate. It operates in the same register as the reflex that makes us turn away from blinding light, except what we turn from is not external brightness, but the glare of our own capacity to choose what we will be. The ancients understood this as a problem of concealment. In Greek thought, aletheia truth meant unconcealment, the drawing back of what hides itself. But what hides is not always hidden by ignorance or accident. Sometimes it conceals itself because we cannot bear to look at it directly. The Gnostics spoke of kenoema, the realm of emptiness and falsity where the soul forgets its divine origin and mistakes shadows for substance. They were mapping an interior territory where human beings dwell in a kind of willful forgetting, a chosen ignorance that feels unchosen. The Buddhists called it avidya, ignorance that is not innocent but participatory. We do not simply fail to see. We arrange our vision so that we will not have to. What they all recognized, in their different languages, was a fundamental tension in human consciousness. We are the beings who can see ourselves seeing, who can know that we know, who can choose to choose. And precisely because of this recursiveness, we can also hide from it. We can use consciousness to obscure consciousness. We can employ our freedom to deny that we are free. The philosophical term for this particular form of self-concealment arrived in the 20th century, mauvaise foi, bad faith. It is not quite lying, because the liar knows the truth and chooses to misrepresent it. It is not quite delusion, because the deluded person genuinely believes the false thing. Bad faith occupies a stranger territory. It is the state of holding two contradictory beliefs at once, knowing and not knowing, choosing and being chosen without quite acknowledging either. It is consciousness split against itself, not cleanly, but in a way that leaves no clear boundary between what is genuine and what is performance, between what we believe and what we pretend to believe. The cafe waiter who becomes nothing but his role, whose gestures take on a mechanical precision that is almost a parody of efficiency, who moves through his duties with an exaggerated attentiveness that somehow empties him of presence, he demonstrates the pattern. He has become pure function, pure waiterness, as though his identity were dictated entirely by his occupation. But he knows, somewhere, that he is more than his role. He knows he could walk away, refuse, or become something else. The bad faith lies in the simultaneity. He inhabits the role as though it were his nature, while knowing it is not. And he maintains this knowing-unknowing through a kind of performance that hides its own performative quality. We recognize this immediately because we have all been that waiter, not necessarily in that profession, but in the structure of consciousness it represents. The person who says, "I had no choice," while knowing, in some unacknowledged chamber of awareness, that choice was possible. The one who claims, "This is just who I am," while sensing that selfhood is not given but made. The individual who insists, "Circumstances forced me," while intuiting that circumstances present occasions, not inevitabilities. In Norse mythology, there is a moment before Ragnarok when the wolf Fenrir strains against his bindings. The gods have chained him with Gleipnir, a fetter made from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. These are things that do not exist, and yet the chain holds. Fenrir remains bound until the final battle, when the bonds will break and he will devour the sun. The image captures something about the nature of the constraints we accept. They are often made from nothing, from assumptions we have not examined, roles we have not questioned, and narratives we have inherited without consent. They are as real as we make them and as unreal as their components. Yet they hold us more securely than iron precisely because we do not recognize them as chains. We experience them as the shape of reality itself. The binding works because Fenrir believes it will hold, or rather, because the binding operates at a level prior to belief in the register of unquestioned assumption of reality as given rather than constructed. This is the realm where bad faith does its deepest work. It is not that we consciously choose imprisonment. It is that we arrange our consciousness so that imprisonment appears as freedom, or at least as necessity, which is its own kind of freedom from responsibility. A woman sits in a marriage that has long since lost whatever vitality it once possessed. She does not hate her husband. She does not particularly love him either, though she uses the word out of habit. When asked why she stays, she speaks of the children, the mortgage, the difficulty of starting over, and the shared history. All of these are real. But beneath them lies something else, the profound relief of not having to choose. As long as circumstances hold her in place, she is sheltered from the vertigo of possibility. The marriage is failing, but her entrapment within it feels like a kind of protection from what she might become if she left, from the nakedness of having to author her own life without the script that staying for the children provides. She half knows this. In moments of private reflection, usually late at night, she glimpses the structure of her own evasion. But the glimpse is brief, and morning returns her to the story that feels true enough. She has no choice. The story is not exactly false, the constraints are real, but it is also not exactly true, because constraints do not determine response. Between any situation and any action lies a gap, narrow as breath, where freedom operates, and it is precisely this gap that bad faith works to conceal. The Christian tradition speaks of this in the language of sin and grace, but beneath the theological vocabulary lies a psychological recognition. The doctrine of original sin, whatever its metaphysical claims, names something about the human condition, that we inherit patterns of estrangement, that we are born into structures of evasion that precede our individual choices. We do not learn bad faith from scratch. We are inducted into it, absorb it from the air we breathe in families and cultures that are themselves fleeing from freedom. But Christianity also insists on something more disturbing, that this inheritance does not absolve us. We are responsible for the patterns we did not create. The concept of original sin holds together two seemingly incompatible truths: that we are born into a condition not of our making, and that we nonetheless bear responsibility for how we inhabit that condition. This is the existential scandal at the heart of Christian anthropology, and it maps directly onto the structure of bad faith. We are thrown into situations we did not choose, but we are not absolved by this thrownness. How we carry our inheritance is still our burden to bear. The Gnostic heresy, rejected by Orthodox Christianity but psychologically insightful, went further. It suggested that the material world itself was a prison, created by a false god to trap souls in ignorance. The true God was distant, unreachable except through secret knowledge that would reveal the prison for what it was. This is bad faith elevated to cosmology, the idea that reality itself is the trap, that existence as such is a form of bondage. The appeal is obvious. If the world is inherently imprisoning, then our entrapment cannot be our fault. We are victims of a cosmic fraud. But even in this extreme form, the insight remains. Human beings have a talent for mistaking their own constructions for external necessity. The Gnostic cosmology is a projection of an inner state, the feeling that we are trapped by existence itself, that simply being here, embodied, limited, bound by circumstances not of our choosing, is the fundamental problem. It is bad faith seeking metaphysical justification. Symbols accumulate around this territory like iron filings around a magnet, the mask that becomes the face, the prison that transforms into a home, the script that replaces spontaneity, the role that devours the person, the armor that fuses to the skin. Each image captures a different facet of the same structure, a protective covering that becomes a cage, a refuge that becomes a cell. We put on the mask for good reasons, to navigate social demands, to protect vulnerability, and to manage the expectations of others. But masks have their own logic. Worn long enough, they shape the face beneath. The boundary between performance and authenticity blurs. We forget where the mask ends and the face begins, or whether there is still a face at all. The person who takes on a professional identity finds that the identity colonizes more and more of their interior life. The one who adopts a public persona discovers that the persona has opinions, preferences, and a way of speaking that persists even in private. The individual who performs confidence eventually cannot locate whatever uncertain thing existed before the performance began. The mask has not hidden the face, it has replaced it. And there is mercy in this, strange as that sounds. The face is vulnerable, the mask is not. The face can be hurt, rejected, and seen in its weakness. The mask receives the blows. So we wear it, and in wearing it, we are protected not just from others, but from the terrible responsibility of presenting ourselves as we are, undefended and accountable. In Japanese aesthetics, there is a concept called one and tatame, the true feelings versus the public facade. But the distinction is not as simple as inner truth versus outer deception. Tatame is not exactly false. It is the face required by social harmony, by the web of obligations and expectations that holds a community together. To express own without consideration of context is not authenticity. It is violence against the social fabric. So people learn to navigate between the two, and in navigating, they begin to wonder, which is more real? The feelings I have or the behavior I sustain? The self I think I am or the self I enact? The question has no clean answer because selfhood is not a substance that can be isolated and examined. It is something that occurs in the space between inner experience and outward expression, between what we feel and what we do, and between what we are in solitude and what we become in relation. Bad faith does not falsify this process so much as exploit its inherent instability. If there is no fixed self to betray, then perhaps there is no betrayal, only the endless negotiation between competing versions of who we might be, with bad faith serving as the mechanism that allows us to avoid choosing definitively between them. A man tells himself he would leave his job if he could afford it. The job corrodes something in him, not dramatically, but slowly, the way water wears stone. He knows this. But the financial obligations are real. Children in school, aging parents, and a standard of living he has come to consider baseline rather than luxury. He calculates, rationalizes, and defers. And beneath the calculations lies the unacknowledged relief. As long as the job is financially necessary, he does not have to ask whether he lacks the courage to leave, even if it weren't. The bad faith here is layered. On the surface, it appears as economic determinism, the belief that money makes the decision for him. Beneath that lies the psychological truth. The economic constraint protects him from having to confront his own fear. But even deeper, there is another turn. Perhaps he does not actually want to leave. Perhaps the dissatisfaction serves its own purpose, providing a narrative of constraint that feels nobler than mere inertia. He is not someone who stays because he lacks imagination or courage. He is someone who stays because he must. The role of trapped breadwinner is more bearable than the role of person who chose security over aliveness. This is bad faith becoming almost transparent to itself. He half knows what he is doing, but the half-knowing is itself part of the structure. To know fully would be to collapse the protective ambiguity. To admit that he chooses to stay would be to accept full responsibility for that choice. To admit that he could leave but won't would be to face his own fear without mitigation. So he maintains the half-knowledge, the split consciousness that allows him to be both victim and agent, both determined and free, without having to inhabit either position completely. The psychoanalytic tradition, beginning with Freud, mapped a different but related territory. The unconscious is not simply hidden content, it is an active process of hiding. Repression is not forgetting, it is the mechanism by which we keep ourselves from remembering. The repressed material exerts force precisely because it is excluded from awareness. It shapes behavior, mood, and relationship patterns, all while remaining officially unknown. But Jung pressed further into the structure. He spoke of the shadow, not just repressed content, but the disowned aspects of self that we project outward onto others or express through symptoms. The shadow is not simply dark. It contains everything we have refused to integrate. It is the repository of unlived life, the potential selves we rejected in the process of becoming who we think we are. And it is always with us, determining more than we acknowledge. Bad faith, in Jungian terms, is the refusal to individuate the turning away from the difficult work of becoming conscious of what we are. It is the preference for persona over self, for collective identity over individual reality, and for the comfort of unconsciousness over the demand of awareness. The person in bad faith is not simply lying to others, or even to themselves in any simple sense. They are choosing to remain in a state of psychological childhood, where others make the decisions, where roles provide ready-made identity, and where consciousness need not turn back on itself with full recognition. The temptation is permanent because consciousness itself is a burden. To be aware of our own awareness, to recognize that we are choosing, to accept that we author our responses even to circumstances we did not create. This is existentially exhausting. Bad faith offers rest. It says, you are what you are, circumstances determine you, your nature is given, and your role is assigned. You need not carry the weight of self-creation, you can be carried. The Buddhist concept of anatta no self seems to point in a different direction, but it circles the same territory. The Buddha taught that there is no permanent, unchanging self to be found. When we look for the self, we find only a collection of processes, sensations, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness itself. None of these constitute a self in any solid sense. The self we believe in is a construction, a story we tell, a pattern we mistake for substance. This could be read as bad faith writ large, human beings everywhere, clinging to a fiction of selfhood that obscures the truth of constant flux and impermanence. But the teaching cuts deeper. The point is not that we should abandon the fiction for some truer vision of selfhood. It is that the very act of clinging to any version of self, true or false, is what generates suffering. Bad faith would be one form of clinging to the idea that we are determined, that we have no choice, that our self is fixed by nature or circumstance. But good faith can also be clinging, insisting on absolute freedom, on radical responsibility, and on the self as a pure project. Both are ways of avoiding the more fundamental truth, that selfhood is neither fixed nor free, but something that arises moment by moment in dependence on conditions we did not create and cannot fully control. From this angle, bad faith is not so much false as incomplete. It grasps part of the truth that we are shaped by forces beyond our control, that circumstances constrain us, that we are thrown into situations not of our making. But it stops there, refusing to see that none of this absolves us of participation. We are simultaneously determined and free, shaped and shaping, caused and causing. The mistake is to insist on one pole to the exclusion of the other. A familiar scene, the argument in which someone says, "You always," or "You never," and the other responds, "I can't help it. That's just how I am." Both statements are attempts to fix identity, to make it solid, predictable, and an object that can be pointed to. The first tries to imprison the other in a pattern. The second tries to use that pattern as an alibi. Neither acknowledges the fluidity of what they're fighting about. The person who says, "That's just how I am," is reaching for the comfort of determinism. If their behavior is a fact of their nature, then it cannot be fairly criticized. They are like the scorpion in the fable who stings the frog even though it means they will both drown. "It's my nature," the scorpion says, as if this explains anything. But human beings are not scorpions. Our nature is not fixed. Or rather, our nature is to be unfixed, to be capable of alteration, to contain possibilities we have not yet enacted. The person who says, "That's just how I am," is performing bad faith in its purest form, using essence as an excuse, while knowing, somewhere, that they are not an essence but a becoming. Yet the other person, the one cataloging patterns, "You always do this," is participating in the same structure from the opposite direction. They are trying to make the other's identity solid enough to indict. They need the pattern to be fixed so the accusation can land. But in fixing it, they deny the other the very capacity for change they are implicitly demanding. The accusation becomes as binding and effective as anything the gods used on Fenrir. The argument cannot resolve because both parties have abandoned the ground where resolution might be possible. The recognition that human beings are always more and less than their patterns, always capable of change and always resisting it, always free and always constrained. To meet in that territory requires giving up the security of fixed positions. It requires each person to hold their own contradictions without collapsing them prematurely into one-sided stories. In alchemical symbolism, there is the image of the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of decomposition, where all forms dissolve into primordial chaos. The alchemists understood this as necessary. To create the philosopher's stone, one must first reduce the materials to their base state and strip away all borrowed form and false structure. Only then can genuine transformation occur. Bad faith is the refusal of nigredo. It is the insistence on maintaining structure even when the structure has become a prison. It says, "Better to remain in a form I recognize, even if it stifles me, than to risk the dissolution that might precede a new form. The fear is legitimate. In the dissolution, there is no guarantee." One might not reconstitute. One might fragment into pieces that cannot be reassembled. The chaos might be permanent. So we cling to the roles, the stories, and the identities that feel unbearable, but at least feel solid. We become the long-suffering spouse, the dedicated employee, the reliable friend, and the dutiful child, and we resent the becoming even as we depend on it. Because underneath the identity we have adopted lies the void of possibility, and possibility is terrifying in a way that even unhappiness is not. Unhappiness has form, possibility is formless. The alchemists also spoke of the massa confusa, the confused mass that precedes all differentiation. In the beginning, everything is mixed together, no separation between self and world, subject and object, or freedom and determinism. Bad faith never fully leaves this primordial confusion. It maintains the undifferentiated state by refusing to separate what must be separated, the circumstances we inherit from the response we make, the situation we are thrown into from the stance we take within it, and the constraints that bind us from the freedom that operates even within constraint. There is a moment, rare but unmistakable, when the structure of bad faith becomes visible from within. It usually comes uninvited. Some shock to the system, loss, illness, confrontation, the sudden clarity that time is finite, causes the protective narratives to momentarily thin. In that moment, one sees how much energy has gone into maintaining the story. One sees that the role being played is a role. One sees that the self that felt so inevitable is, in fact, a construction held in place by constant, exhausting effort. The revelation is usually brief. The old structures rush back in, refortified by the very anxiety the glimpse produced. But something has shifted. A kind of knowledge has been introduced that cannot be fully unlearned. One knows now that one knows. The split in consciousness becomes harder to maintain unconsciously. Bad faith must become more deliberate, which is to say, less effective. It begins to feel like a lie, even as one continues to live it. This is a dangerous moment, not because anything external has changed, but because the internal structure that made the existing arrangement bearable has been damaged. One can no longer believe in one's own story quite so completely. The comfort that came from feeling determined, from experiencing one's life as inevitable, begins to erode. What rushes in is the awareness of freedom, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a lived condition. And freedom, at this intensity, feels less like liberation than like abandonment. One has been left alone with one's own life. No script, no alibi, no authority that can make the decisions on one's behalf. In the Prometheus myth, the Titan brings fire to humanity against the will of Zeus. The fire is not just practical technology, it is the light of consciousness, the capacity for self-reflection, and the ability to see ourselves as others see us. But with this gift comes punishment. Prometheus is chained to a rock where an eagle devours his liver each day, and each night the liver regenerates so the punishment can continue. The myth captures the recursive agony of consciousness. The wound that awareness inflicts heals only to be inflicted again, endlessly. Human beings live in the aftermath of this theft. We have the fire, which means we have the capacity to see our own seeing, to know our own knowing. But we also have the eagle, the punishment that comes with awareness, the eternal return of the need to confront what we are and what we are becoming. Bad faith is the attempt to escape the eagle, to somehow have consciousness without its attendant suffering. It is the hope that we can be aware without being fully aware, that we can know without being responsible for what we know. But the fire cannot be returned. Once stolen, it remains. We cannot unchoose consciousness. We can only obscure it partially, temporarily, through the various mechanisms of evasion that bad faith provides. And perhaps this is part of the Promethean punishment too, not just the eagle, but the knowledge that we could free ourselves if we would only reach for the key. The chains are ultimately of our own making. They persist because we continue to forge them, link by link, even as we lament their weight. A quieter image, someone sitting alone in a room they have lived in for years. The furniture is familiar. The patterns of light through the window follow known rhythms. Outside, the world continues traffic, weather, and the ordinary commotion of other lives being lived. Inside, there is the feeling of being separate from all that, removed from the stream of events, a consciousness watching itself watch the world. In this solitude, the question can sometimes surface without the noise of justification. Who have I become? Not who I meant to become, or who I should be, or who circumstances made me, but who I am, actually, beneath all the stories. The question has no comfortable answer, because any answer would immediately become another story, another form that consciousness could hide behind. To ask the question genuinely is to remain in the discomfort of not knowing, to sit with the recognition that selfhood is not a thing to be discovered but a process to be enacted over and over in each moment of choice. Bad faith cannot survive this kind of sustained attention. It requires a certain amount of distraction, of outward focus, of immersion in role and routine. When consciousness turns back on itself too directly, the structures that enabled self-deception become visible as structures. One sees the performance as performance. And once seen, it becomes harder to perform convincingly, even to oneself. But this is not enlightenment or liberation. It is just exposure, and exposure is cold. Without the shelter that bad faith provides, one must face the weather directly. The freedom that appears is not freedom to do whatever one wants. It is the much more burdensome freedom of having to become what one will become, knowing that no excuse will ultimately hold, that circumstances may constrain but do not compel, and that one is, in the end, answerable for the life one has made. The ancient Stoics had a practice, memento mori, the remembrance of death, not as a morbid obsession, but as a clarifying discipline. To remember that time is finite is to strip away the protective illusion of endless deferral. The person who believes they have forever can afford to delay choice, to remain in roles that no longer fit, and to let circumstances make decisions by default. But the one who knows their death is real and approaching must confront what they are doing with the time they have. Bad faith depends on the feeling of unlimited time. As long as change can be postponed to some indefinite future, the need to choose now can be avoided. Someday I will leave this job, this marriage, this city. Someday I will become who I really am. But someday is the alibi that allows today to continue unchanged. It is the future tense that protects the present from interrogation. Memento mori collapses this protection. Death is not someday, it is one day, a day that could be today, and even if not today, then some specific day that approaches with each passing moment. This knowledge really held, not just acknowledged, makes bad faith harder to sustain. The question becomes, is this how I want to spend the time I have? Not, Is this the life I was meant to live? Or is this what circumstances permit? But simply, is this what I choose to do with the hours I am given? The question is brutal in its simplicity. It allows no refuge in determinism or necessity. It does not care about roles or expectations or what other people need. It asks only, what are you doing with your life? And underneath that question is the more difficult one. What are you not doing? What possibility are you refusing? What becoming are you evading? Most people cannot bear this for long. The mind, left to itself, produces discomfort, anxiety, restlessness, and the urge to do something, anything, to escape the nakedness of simply being. We fill our lives with noise, with obligation, and with the constant stimulation that prevents us from having to face the question of what we are doing and why. The monastery cell is unbearable not because it is empty, but because it is full of what we have been fleeing, full of the unasked questions and the unacknowledged choices. Bad faith is the opposite of hesychia. It is the commitment to remain perpetually distracted, perpetually immersed in externality, and perpetually defended against the encounter with one's own consciousness. It fills the cell with furniture and noise and obligation until the space for reflection disappears. It makes busyness into virtue, distraction into necessity, and evasion into survival. Yet there is another turn to consider. Perhaps bad faith is not only evasion, but also, paradoxically, a stage in the process of becoming conscious. The child does not struggle with bad faith because the child has not yet developed the capacity for self-reflection that makes it possible. Bad faith emerges with consciousness itself. It is the shadow cast by awareness. To be capable of bad faith is already to be capable of something more. The person who feels trapped by their own lies, who senses the inauthenticity of their performance even as they continue it, who experiences their life as somehow not quite their own, this person is closer to genuine choice than the one who inhabits their role with complete unconsciousness. The discomfort is a sign of awakening, however partial. The split in consciousness is painful because consciousness is beginning to recognize its own splitness. From this perspective, bad faith is not the enemy, but a necessary passage. It is what we move through in the process of becoming capable of genuine choice. We cannot leap directly from unconscious immersion in a role to conscious self-authorship. We must first pass through the intermediate stage, where we are aware enough to feel the falseness of our position, but not yet capable of abandoning it. We must live for a time in the uncomfortable knowledge that we are performing a version of ourselves we no longer believe in, while not yet knowing how to be otherwise. This is the purgatorial dimension of bad faith. It is not hell, because hell would be absolute unconsciousness, the complete identification with a role that feels no friction. And it is not liberation, because liberation would be the capacity to simply be without performance or self-deception. It is the middle state, the awareness of inauthenticity without yet the courage or clarity to be authentic, however authenticity might be understood. The question then becomes, what makes the passage possible? What allows someone to move from bad faith towards something more genuine? The answers cannot be prescriptive. This is not a manual, but patterns emerge. Crisis often plays a role, the shock that disrupts the existing structure so completely that the old stories no longer hold. But crisis alone is not sufficient. Many people pass through devastating events and emerge with their bad faith intact, perhaps even strengthened. The loss becomes another reason why choice is impossible, another proof of determination by external forces. What seems necessary is a kind of willingness not to change exactly, but to remain present to the discomfort of one's own evasion without immediately seeking relief. To feel the weight of freedom without rushing to put it down. To recognize the bad faith as it operates without justifying it or condemning it. This requires a quality of attention that is rare. A capacity to observe oneself without judgment, severe enough to trigger defensiveness, but also without the kind of permissiveness that would allow the pattern to continue undisturbed. In older religious language, this might be called repentance metanoia, the change of mind, the turning around, but not repentance as self-flagellation or moral condemnation. Rather, repentance as the willingness to see what one has been doing, to acknowledge it without excuse, and to consider that another way of being might be possible. It is a shift in how the question is held, not in what is done about it. Toward the end of Plato's Republic, there is the myth of Er the soldier who dies in battle but returns to life to report what he saw in the afterlife. Before souls are reborn, they are given the chance to choose their next life. Some choose wisely, selecting lives of obscurity and integrity. Others choose power, beauty, fame lives that seem glorious but contain hidden suffering. The myth suggests that we choose our fate, but we choose under conditions we do not control. We choose based on what we learned in previous lives, and we choose under the influence of forgetfulness, drinking from the river Lethe before birth, so that we enter life without memory of what we chose. The image is psychologically precise. We are constantly choosing what we will become, but we make these choices in a state of partial amnesia. We forget that we are choosing. We forget that the life we inhabit is not simply given, but selected, even if the selection was unconscious or made long ago. Bad faith is forgetting that we have chosen, or could choose, differently. It is the drinking from Lethe while still alive, the cultivation of forgetfulness about our own agency. But unlike the souls in Plato's myth, we can remember before death. We can become conscious of our choosing, while there is still time to choose otherwise. This is the strange mercy built into human existence, that we are recursive enough to see our own seeing, to know our own knowing, and to become aware of the structures of evasion we have built and might unbuild. The capacity for bad faith and the capacity for its transcendence are the same capacity, consciousness turning back on itself. Late afternoon light in an empty room. No one is here to witness what happens or doesn't happen, no role to perform, no audience to satisfy. Just the fact of being alive, alone, in this particular moment. The habits of thought that usually fill the space, the planning, the reviewing, the narratives of who one is and what one should be doing, temporarily quiet. What remains is something harder to name, a sense of existing without justification, of being here without purpose or reason, simply as a fact. In this suspension, the mechanisms of bad faith become visible not as failures, but as the continuous work they always were. The sense of being trapped is revealed as something actively maintained. The feeling of having no choice is exposed as a choice, the choice to not choose. The conviction that circumstances determine everything shows itself as a story told to protect against the vertigo of freedom. Nothing has changed in the room. The furniture, the light, the sounds from outside all remain as they were, but something in the quality of attention has shifted. For a moment, there is no need to be other than what one is, and therefore no need to pretend to be determined by forces beyond control. For a moment, the exhausting labor of maintaining bad faith can cease. The moment will not last. The old structures will return, they always do, because we need them to navigate the world, to relate to others, and to maintain some coherence of self across time. But the memory of the moment persists. It becomes a kind of touchstone, proof that another way of experiencing existence is possible, that the prison has no lock, that the chains are made of nothing. This is what remains to be said, that bad faith protects us from freedom's weight, and the protection is not simply cowardice. It is a form of care for our own fragility, an acknowledgement that we cannot bear the full burden of our own consciousness all the time. To be always and completely aware of our freedom and always and completely responsible for what we are becoming, this would be crushing. We need the shelter of determinism, the comfort of role, and the alibi of circumstances. We need to be able to say, sometimes, I had no choice, even when we did. The error is not in seeking this shelter, but in mistaking it for the whole of reality, in forgetting that it is shelter and not the landscape itself. Bad faith becomes destructive not when it offers temporary respite, but when it becomes permanent refuge, when we confuse the hiding place with home. What remains is the question of how to live in the knowledge of this, how to recognize bad faith in oneself without condemning it or oneself, how to acknowledge our freedom without being crushed by it, how to accept the burden of self-authorship while still allowing for the protection that makes ordinary life possible. There is no solution to offer, no technique to practice, and no program to follow. There is only the ongoing work of attention, noticing when consciousness has hidden from itself, recognizing the mechanisms of evasion as they operate, and choosing carefully, imperfectly, moment by moment to remain a little more present to the weight one carries. The weight does not become lighter, but the way it is carried changes. It is no longer a burden that has been imposed, no longer a fate that has been suffered. It becomes something closer to a task that has been accepted not eagerly, perhaps, and not without continued resistance, but accepted nonetheless as the condition of being human. To be the animal that must choose what it will become, knowing all along that the choosing itself is what makes us most alive and most alone, most burdened and most free.